Hello, I am Joel McLeod,
I'm Ron Montana.
and welcome to the 905er. When this election began, Roland and I wanted to focus on the issues that would matter most to this region, free from the rhetoric of party lines and sound bites. At the start of this election, we were fortunate that a topic we focus on a lot on this podcast, that of housing, became front and center in the national debate. We were lucky to get Mike Moffat back on to share his expertise of the matter with our listeners and to keep us informed. Now, in keeping with that mission, we are looking to what we think ought to be the number one issue this election, aside from COVID-19, of course, and that is climate change. This summer saw climate change creep back into the headlines, stealing attention away from COVID-19, and for good reason. This year saw a record-breaking heat wave sweep the west coast, resulting in a town burning to the ground. Here in Ontario, we have seen one of the wettest summers on record. And it is safe to say that human behavior has irrevocably changed our climate. As well, climate change remains one of the top polling issues of the electorate Canada-wide. And yet, it has barely made a point of debate in this election. In keeping with our effort to focus on the issues that are important to the 905, we reached out and invited Keith Brooks from Environmental Defense to the podcast. Keith is the program's director at Environmental Defense, where he seeks to advocate for a cleaner environment and a greener economy. He has a master's in environmental studies and has written many times on the need for a more sustainable economy. Keith joins us today to share his expertise. As well, before we begin, a friendly reminder that if you are enjoying the 905er, please consider supporting us on Patreon. You can also take the time and buy us a coffee. Both of the links are in the show notes. Either way, your support will go a long way to help us continue to tell the stories of the 905. Thank you and enjoy. Okay, well, we'd like to welcome Keith Brooks of Environmental Defense to the 905er podcast. Keith, thank you very much for taking your time this morning to come on and join us for this, what we think is an important discussion to be had about the environment, about climate change, and the importance that it is to the 905 region here. So, Keith, let me ask you. Let me start by this: the discussion that we've been having in this campaign, this election campaign so far. To me, I haven't really seen any focus on climate change. That it keeps ranking up there with people's top concerns in public opinion polls, but I haven't really seen that come out as a major discussion in the national discourse so far in this campaign. And maybe, I'd like to kind of remind our listeners about why it is that we really need to be concerned about this, especially with those of us living in the 905 region.
Well, the risks of climate change, the evidence of climate change, the rate at which the climate is changing are all getting increasingly grave. I think, we keep hearing warnings. We heard one from the International Energy Agency, about what would it take to stay within a 1.5 degree world, which is the goal that was set in the Paris Agreement in 2015. And they said, it's quite a drastic transformation. It will take some effort to do, but it does leave the economy better off. But, I think a lot of people heard about the wildfires out west this year. This is not the first year we've had fires, but, they're saying 700 or more people died as a result of those fires and the extreme heat out west. I mean, we've had people die here. There was a flood in Toronto in 2013, right? 81 people died there. People died from heat out in Montreal a couple of years ago. I mean, climate change is a real and present danger. It's actually costing us lives now, and it's going to get worse unless we take drastic action to reduce emissions now. This is the decade. This decade between now and 2030 is a critical decade for us to make quite significant changes to our energy system and to our economy. And it's really important, that the government that goes to Ottawa after this election is serious about climate change, because they're going to be in power into the middle of this decade, this critical decade.
So what you're saying is, I guess that's it. The one factor that always pops into this discussion is we keep hearing about the need of, we keep hearing deadlines. 2020 is a deadline. 2030, 2050 is a major deadline. But like, you're the expert. Where are we on the in terms of the critical timeline of getting a handle on this problem? Are we getting closer to the end, like the absolute due date, the point of no return?
I mean, there's not a point of no return necessarily. Like, we're going to hit certain degrees of warming, or already more than 1 degree of warming is taking place. And the only way that we reverse that is if we take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is very difficult to do. We're going to plant a billion trees, a couple billion trees here in Canada, but still, that's not actually going to reduce carbon out of the atmosphere on the level that we need. So we have to stop emitting carbon. That's what's critical. We have to do so sooner rather than later. And the more quickly that we do that, the less amount of warming that we'll see. And we can kind of stop this runaway train and try to figure out what's happening there. But there's not a point of no return at which point we should give up. The degrees of warming matter. And the IPCC, the international panel, looked at this and they said, look, the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is literally hundreds of millions of people are put in harm's way as a result of climate change. And the same thing goes as we incrementally warm more and more. So, 2.5 is worse than 2, 3 is worse than that. So, there's not a point of no return, but we have an urgent need to stop. And that 1.5 degree of warming still needs to be the goal. It is the goal that we agreed to in Paris. We're starting to model what that looks like here in Canada and internationally. We're not on track to reach that goal. Right now, we're on track for 3 degrees, maybe 3.5. So we really need to up our game, and we need to do so urgently. Or, these deaths that we're seeing, this destruction that we're seeing is going to get worse and worse. That's what we're facing.
How does Canada fit into the kind of global picture of this? We feel, to an extent, because we're next to the US, you always feel that, well, we're not as bad as the US, but compared with, say, European nations, how are we doing? I mean, you can tell from my accent, I emigrated here. I remember when I came to Canada, it seemed like the Green Movement hadn't even started, whereas I felt like I'd grown up with it. Are we behind, or are we just? Is that our slowness to deal with the issues that are coming our way just typical of every nation?
No, we're behind here actually in Canada. There's some polls, and polls recently have said that Canadians think that Canada is now serious about climate change and we're in the game, and we are getting a lot of new commitments out of the federal government previously, and now during the election campaign we're getting new commitments to go further. But the reality is that we are behind. We're behind all the G7 nations. We're the only country in the G7, in fact, where emissions have risen since we signed the Paris Accord. Emissions continue to go up in Canada, and that's driven mainly by oil and gas and transportation. Those are the two largest sources of emissions here in Canada. In fact, those two together are about half of our emissions. But we're lagging behind our peers. We have weaker targets, and even the US now, under the new administration with President Biden, they've committed to a target that is stronger than what any of the parties, well, not any of the parties, but what's stronger than what Canada's government had committed to kind of prior to this election season unfolding. So we're behind all of the rest of the developed countries. That's an important thing. And emissions, not just in our commitments, but actually in emissions from Canada continue to rise when they need to be falling quite dramatically. And certain countries in Europe have actually made great strides in reducing emissions. The UK, Germany, other countries, and we actually need to up our game to catch up to where those leading countries are at.
You mentioned the need for a focus on oil and gas and transportation, which is, I think when you hear oil and gas, you're thinking immediately your thoughts go to Alberta. That's not what this podcast is about. We're focusing on the 905, which it does play a major factor. I mean, the 905 is one of the most populated regions of the country. And when people think of transportation, I mean, everybody's thinking of getting on the QEW, the 401, the 403, and just being stuck in gridlock traffic, driving in and out of Toronto on a daily commute to work, which of course doesn't do any wonders for the environment. Maybe we can talk about the need for better infrastructure, better planning to change these behaviors. One of the things that Roland and I have noticed over the last course of the pandemic has been more and more of us are working from home. How do we encourage that so that we have less cars on the road, less commuting, less pollution in the air? What changes do we need to make in the 905, I guess, to kind of really tackle this issue?
Yeah, you're right, Joel. So, 905 GTHA is about 40% of Ontario's emissions, and Ontario has the second largest emissions. We're second to Alberta because we've got a big population base here. And our emissions in Ontario are driven by transportation and by buildings in the GTHA. In the larger Ontario region, of course, industry is a big factor. But our electricity grid's pretty clean in Ontario because we phased out coal. There's some problems that the provincial government wants to rely more on natural gas, and that's something we should be looking out for. But in terms of individuals and what we can do, our transportation habits and also the buildings that we live and work in, those are the really big things that we need to change. Working from home is certainly part of the solution. Getting cars off the road, certainly part of the solution. If we're going to be traveling, it's better if we're traveling by transit, or we're traveling by bike, or we're walking, or things like that. In order to be able to do so, of course, that means we need to be building communities in a particular way, not building car-dependent communities where you have little choice but to get in your car. And I'm from the 905, so I know that that's the way it is for a lot of people. And I don't blame someone that lives in a car-dependent community for being dependent upon a car. They don't have a choice. So it's about how we build our region. Are we building at the densities that we need to support transit? Are we building all of the shops that you might need so that you could walk or bike or take, some kind of active transportation to get the things that you need? I live in a compact neighborhood in Toronto. My kids walk to school. I walk to the local store. I could walk to anything I want, and I could bike down to my office. So, that's a great situation for me. And that's what we need to be doing in the 905. And there's a lot of development taking place in the 905. There's a push right now, and this is more provincial than federal, but we're talking about affordable housing, which is a serious issue. The solution that the developers would like to see is just more urban sprawl, more growth, more car-dependent communities. It's been said, though, that urban sprawl is the oil sands of Ontario. This is the driver of emissions in Ontario because it's building more car-dependent communities, more large single-family homes that are not energy efficient. And that needs to change. Our development patterns need to change to be more dense, and we need to be adding density in areas that are already slated for development, not pushing further out to the green belt or areas beyond, or even what we're calling the contested countryside, but the area that is not in the green belt but not currently slated for development, that is what's left of those farmers' fields and the green spaces that you'd see if you go up near Milton or up further north in northern parts of Burlington that's not yet developed. So that's a huge thing. I just want to say on the transportation piece, electric vehicles are part of the solution, absolutely. I think Canada's making some pledges around electrified vehicles. It's a good thing. We need to be going further in that direction. Unfortunately, though, on this one, Canadians actually they should know that we actually drive the most polluting cars in the world because we're driving bigger and bigger cars all the time. 80% of the cars sold in Canada now are SUVs and trucks. And I think these are quite prevalent in the 905. So we want to get electrified cars. We want to change our transportation patterns. We want to build densities, but we really can't be driving these massive vehicles. I know it's not nice to hear that, but these big cars have a big footprint, and that actually needs to change.
The end result of all this will be a far more traditional society in many ways, it always seems to me, and that we have lived throughout history, generally in urban settlements, or rural and urban settlements, but that depended on getting around by foot. So things were designed for that. And our problem, particularly in the 905, well, across North America really is we designed for the car, and now we're trying to fix that mistake, and it's going to be a huge challenge. We're not going to ask you to sort of rate the parties or anything like that, but is there anything in particular that you have seen during this election that you think stands out as distinct or a positive sign? I mean, it seems every party will say that the other party is backslipping or either not going far enough or going so far that they'll destroy the economy in the process. That doesn't really help us make a judgment about their policies. But what do you see as a kind of independent outsider? when you look at the current debate?
I think one of the really good things is that all of the leaders, all of the parties do have some kind of plan to fight climate change. That wasn't always so. I think the last election, that's one of the things that the parties learned is that you actually need to have a somewhat serious plan to fight climate change that details some policies, some things that you're going to do to actually fight climate change. And so now all of the major parties do have a plan. Those plans vary in terms of the stringency. So, like, how ambitious are they? What kind of targets are they setting? Are they in line with this 1.5 degree world that we need to be on track for? They're not all aligned. So, people should take a look. What are the targets that people have set? What have they committed to reducing it? So, and the targets are really wonky, right? But it's like, I'm going to reduce emissions by X% by year Y. And the year that we're really looking at, and that the climate community says Canada's fair share is to reduce emissions by 60% from 2005. But anyway, 60% by 2030. That's what we should be looking for. We also, and I know we're talking about 905, but we need to have a serious conversation about the future of oil and gas in this country. It still looms large. Open up the business papers, open up any of the papers, in fact, and you'll learn about the price of oil and is this pipeline getting built and this project approved and all this kind of stuff. This is a really important factor for everybody in Canada. We need to send people to Ottawa who are going to admit that we actually need to phase out oil and gas. And that means the phasing out the use of it, but also its production. It is the pulling of oil and gas from the ground and turning it into fuel that's responsible for a quarter of Canada's emissions. Those emissions continue to rise. So if someone's not willing to talk about a phase out of fossil fuels, they're not serious about climate change. They're not committed to it. Go ahead, Joel.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because here in Oakville we have the Petro-Canada refinery where the oil is pumped in from Alberta down to that refinery to be refined into gasoline for us to use. There are a lot of people who say, okay, fine, we need to get off oil and gas, like you're just saying. What do we transition to? How? It's easy to say that, but when you really think about it, that is a huge, huge endeavor. I mean, between like the plastics manufacturing in Sarnia, chemical manufacturing that happens there, as I just said, oil refining here in Canada, in Oakville, and also just the fact that there's millions of jobs that are connected to that industry. We say let's get off oil and gas, but that's a huge, that's almost like a moonshot endeavor. I'm going to play devil's advocate and say, can it be done?
Yeah, I mean, the technology exists for us to do it. And in fact, the answer lies in electrification of the economy for the most part. So it means making our cars electric. It means making home heating and water heating electric. And it means that there's some other solutions there's some industries that are going to be difficult to address. And there's some role then for some hydrogen and some of those places that are really hard to address. But most of the solution lies in electricity. We already have electricity grids all over the place. Electric cars will, we hope, soon be widely available. Electric home heating is actually already available. There's incentives to help people kind of do that. The technology is there. It's been modeled by umpteen scientists and academics and whatnot. And there's other countries that are already kind of leading the way and making these commitments. So if Canada is to follow suit, we're definitely not going alone. And yes, there's jobs there, but it's important to think about. So Sarnia, Chemical Valley, there's jobs there, but there's a ton of pollution too, and there's people who are impacted by that pollution. In particular, First Nations people who live downwind of those refineries are getting choked out by sulfur dioxide plumes all the time. There's environmental racism taking place in Canada as a result of the petroleum and petrochemical industry, the plastics industry, which is highly problematic. And people in Oakville fought against a gas plant because they knew that was pollution associated with that, and that gas plant was going to be sited quite near where that refinery is, and the refinery and the highway and those things are already contributing to poor air quality. So it's not just about climate change, but you want cleaner air to breathe. Well, we phased out coal. That made the air a lot cleaner. If we phase out the rest of the production and refining of fossil fuels and their use on the roads, that's also going to improve our air quality. In fact, we modeled it, and for the GTHA, if all cars were electric and trucks actually were a lot cleaner too, it would save billions of dollars in public health costs, billions of dollars in benefits come to people. And actually, each electric car, if they're all electrified, give a $10,000 public benefit in terms of better air quality, avoided hospitalizations, avoided deaths. The jobs piece is a serious consideration, though, and that's what people are talking about, a just transition, or there's a couple of different terms for it. But like, yes, people's livelihoods are going to be impacted by the phase out of fossil fuels. We need to take this seriously. So first, we need to commit to that phase out. We need to plan for that phase out. And that means not just planning for technology to replace the energy that we get from fossil fuels, but planning for an economy that gives jobs and livelihoods and supports communities and workers in the way that they need, so that this transition is gradual, that it helps people find new jobs, or maybe those positions, are phased out through attrition. People get early, packages to retirement, things like that. We need to plan. We need to plan for that. And doing so is much, much more compassionate than pretending that there's going to be a demand for fossil fuels forever, and we don't need to plan for this transition. If we don't plan for it, then those workers, those communities, those people who rely on those industries are going to be left high and dry. It'll be like when we lost all those manufacturing jobs here in Ontario, or when cod fishery collapsed out east, or the forestry industry. I mean, if the transition's coming, we ought to plan for it. We can do it, and if we are compassionate to workers and communities, I mean, that's a much, much better approach.
Well, there is something to be said about that, because there's a thought that India and China they need to buy all of our oil. And to my understanding, China is undergoing a massive electrification project in its own board. I mean, and that, quite frankly, if China and India follow suit on a massive electrification, greening of their economies, that's half the world's population right there that they're going to be kind of taken off the market in terms of needing to consume oil and gas. So I see your point about kind of needing to be planning for the economics reality of what's coming down the road. That was just
we benefit from getting out in front of it too, really, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if we're laggards, if we're kind of at the end of the pack, then we get hit hard when the transition really does come and demand does dry up. If we're out front of it, then we're part of the solutions providers. We're providing the solutions that we need, but also the whole world needs. The whole world needs to decarbonize, and we're going to continue to innovate. I mean, the innovation that's happening in this space is quite amazing. I mean, you can read, again, like you could read about the oil companies, but also read about new battery technology in cars that's allowing them to go further. Read about how much the price of solar panels and wind turbines have come down in the last couple decades. It is astonishing, the leaps and gains that we're making there. And, we want to be part of that game. We should be figuring out what is our role, what's Canada bring to this kind of clean, decarbonized economy that provides jobs and livelihood for the next generation, because it can't continue to be fossil fuels and just kind of natural resources. We kind of need to grow up a little bit here.
If there's one thing that all the parties should be talking about with regard to the environment that they're not, what would you say that is?
That's a good question. I mean, for us, the three issues that we're really looking for from federal parties is a serious plan around climate change. The other one is some action on plastics. I don't think plastics are getting enough attention during this election season. And the third one is reform of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which regulates toxic chemicals in consumer products and more broadly kind of in Canada. Plastics is an issue, though, that the public cares a lot about. 80% of Canadians want to see some federal action on plastics. Again, it's another place for Canada. We made some promises, but we're behind our peers in Europe who are banning 11 single-use plastics, kind of taking some serious action. I don't think we're talking enough about what is actually the plan here to deal with plastics. And there's a little bit of dissonance here where we have, as Joel kind of mentioned, we've got a petrochemical industry, we've got a plastics industry that creates jobs. And so on the one hand, we're saying, we're going to ban some of these plastics and phase out these things. On the other hand, we're subsidizing the petrochemical and plastics manufacturing industry. And in fact, maybe we believe that future demand for oil is going to be moving towards plastics. Well, that actually can't be the case. we need to use less plastic, and we need to be less reliant upon jobs for plastics. And I think that's a piece that's important to be talking about.
Well, when we mentioned that, we in the previous government prior to the pandemic, there was talk of the banning of single-use plastics and that kind of thing, and then you had on top of that introduction of a carbon price into the economy. And a lot of the naysayers were saying that this doesn't do anything. It's a drop in the bucket, and it's a waste of time. As somebody who studied this, could you maybe give us an enlightenment or just kind of educate us? How effective are these policies? When you say banning single-use plastics, like the plastic bags at the grocery store, or straws, and the plastic forks and spoons that you get for barbecues and stuff. When we say we're going to ban this stuff and introduce things like carbon pricing, like these seems like very small, ineffectual policies, but how much does it impact does it have on moving us toward our targets?
I mean, economists love carbon pricing, and the World Economic Forum, the World Bank, the Economist magazine, all of these different places have written up about Canada's carbon tax, about BC's carbon tax, about how this is a model that the world should follow. I think for a long time we were very timid about the level we'd set our carbon tax at, and people were right to be skeptical about its impact, though. There are commitments now from some parties to increase the price of that carbon tax quite significantly, which is good. I mean, and economists like it because you make the cost of the thing that you don't want higher, right? And give people back. The money gets rebated back to people. So you and me and everybody, we're no worse off. But now we're being disincentivized, from doing one thing. And that money's put back to us, and we can make choices about what we want to do with it. I mean, the carbon tax, most research says that it is driving down emissions. It does need to rise significantly, though, to have the impact that we need. And again, it's not a silver bullet. There's no silver bullets when it comes to fighting climate change, but it is a tool that we should be using. It's one of the many things that should be part of the policy mix here in Canada. And one thing that actually we're not talking about is that there's a recent polling that says Canadians would support a carbon tax even more so if they knew that the money collected by that carbon tax was put back into clean energy and low carbon solutions, which is not what we're doing in Canada. We're rebating it to people. So I'd love to see that, actually. I'd love to see this talk about, in the States, we're talking about a Green New Deal. We're talking about that a little bit here in Canada, but not as much. And if Canadians support this idea of reinvesting carbon tax monies back into solutions, that's kind of the premise of that kind of retooling of the economy that I think would be very impactful and seems to be popular with people. But anyway, carbon tax, not a silver bullet, certainly should be part of the solution set. Economists all over the world love it, and they look at Canada and say this is a model we should follow. Politically contentious, though, obviously. And then with respect to the bans of plastic, yeah, the materials that the previous government had said they were going to ban, I think it's about 1% of the amount of plastics that we use. So it is a drop in the bucket, but it's an important first step. It sends a message to individuals, to all of us, to your listeners. It sends a message to plastic producers. It sends a message to retailers, everybody that, this plastic, we actually do need to get off of it. And what Canada has done so far is they have added plastics to the list of toxic substances under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which is kind of nerdy, but the important part about it is that it gives the federal government regulatory ability to take action on plastics. And banning some plastics is only one of those tools. Just like the carbon tax is only one tool to fight climate change, those bans on plastic are just one of the tools. It's the first step, actually. The listing of toxics is the first step. The banning is the second step. More steps need to follow, and I haven't heard anybody kind of lay out a comprehensive plan and admit that we do really need to be using less plastic here in Canada. And it's not all plastic, by the way. It's not like your phone or your bike tire or whatever, your car seat, things like that. The plastic we're talking about is plastic packaging, which is 40% of the plastic that we use is this single-use stuff. It's super, super durable. Plastic's amazing, right? It's a super durable product, lasts for a long time. Unfortunately, we use a ton of it to put it, something in a package that we use only for mere seconds and then throw away. that's the piece that needs to be disrupted. And I'm not hearing enough conversation about where that goes.
It's that's a good point. I mean, I think so. I mean, just checking through the platforms, two of the parties at least, and I'm presuming the Green Party will just take them for as a automatic. So I believe the Liberals are talking about phasing out plastics, requiring 50% to be recyclable by 2030, and the NDP are like, we're going to ban plastics. Was it that kind of? I mean, I guess that really comes down to the difference between the NDP and the Liberals on so many policies. That the Liberals will tend to will phase this in, and I guess it's that thing. Politics is the art of the possible and everything. You can't do it if no one will vote for it, and the NDP will be okay, do it now. Do you have? I mean, again, without asking you to sort of point at one party and say these guys are better, do you feel that the more kind of radical approach is needed now? That just we're going to ban it, full stop, deal with it, or is that kind of phased approach a wiser way to go?
So I just want your listeners to be clear that because I work for a charity, we have to be very careful about anything that we would say that's partisan. I can't come out and say that one plan's better than another, or one party's approach is better than another. So I'm going to be a little bit limited in what I can say here, but we've got a serious plastic problem in Canada. We only recycle 9% of the plastic that we use here in Canada. We all have our blue boxes, and in fact, Ontario pioneered the blue box program back in the 80s, and we were going to go gangbusters on recycling. Well, here we are, 40 years later, recycling only 9% of the plastic that we use. We need to up our game dramatically. The World Economic Forum, I think, is the ones who said, by 2050, we're going to have more plastic than fish in the oceans if we don't do something. And I think, Canada, we like to say, oh, we're a small player, but we're not. We're a major plastics producer. We're really poor on recycling. And also we produce the most garbage per capita, I think, of anywhere in the world. So we've got to dramatically up our game. And this plastic, is getting, we talked about the oceans, but 10,000 tons of plastic end up in the Great Lakes every year as well. And this all gets flushed down St. Lawrence and eventually out to the oceans too. Our plastic is ending up in the Philippines and Malaysia and all kinds of developing countries. Like, we really have to up our game. Now, what are the solutions? I think it's a complex issue. And that's why I'm saying there should be more discussion about this issue during the election. The election is a key opportunity for Canadians to kind of talk about what kind of policies would they accept? What kind of policies do we need? What can the federal government do? And the federal government's powers are limited, as you said, because there's kind of the limits of political ability. What are voters going to elect you for? But there's also limits under the Constitution of what a federal power can do. And like the federal government tried to put in a carbon tax, and the Ontario government and the Alberta government decided to try to sue them for that. They lost, but thankfully the federal powers to do this carbon pricing was affirmed, and that's good. But a similar thing is happening on plastics now. So the federal government has done this thing. They've said plastics are toxic under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and now a coalition of plastic producers are actually suing the federal government. Imperial Oil, Dow, and Nova Chemicals, the three largest plastic producers in Canada, are taking the government to court on this. And I think that some of the provinces are going to jump in on this too and saying, hey, you don't have federal powers to do that. So, the solutions, it's challenging. It's challenging to figure them out with the public, with the companies, with the provinces, and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to say there's a simple solution here. I'm just saying we've got to be talking about these things and finding our way to those solutions.
Well, yeah, and you're absolutely right that these, if for the tiny percentage of people who dive into the actual platforms and go through line by line, stuff is there, but this isn't being mentioned. And these are things that actually people would be interested in hearing, because there's a clear difference between the three parties who are kind of dominating this election. And that's just such a shame, and it just speaks to the problems that we have in our democracy at the moment with the way that we debate. To go in a slightly different direction and to put it into an Ontario perspective, how big a deal was it to our progress when Ontario's cap and trade was cancelled. Would if we still had cap and trade rather than basically having a carbon tax imposed on us from the federal government, would that have been a better system, or do we actually have a better one now because the federal government stepped in? Again, question. I'm asking you to make a bit of a judgment, but I'll...
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. And there's not a simple answer there. Again, environmental defense, we did support the cap and trade program that the provincial government had put in place. It was not perfect, but it was something that we could work with. We wanted to see certain elements of that plan strengthened, but we feel the same way about the federal carbon price that's in place right now. There's certain elements that could be strengthened, in particular, the way that it deals with industry. Industrial emissions are largely not paying a price in Canada under the federal system right now. And Ontario has an even weaker system that the federal government has said could be put in place in lieu of the federal system. So I'd say industrial emitters in Ontario are at this point still pretty much unregulated. None of them have paid a penny in a carbon tax yet. Whereas they were paying under cap and trade system. In fact, the cap and trade system, they held auctions where they sold off the permits that get traded. And those permits, they sold out every year. And we were in the joint auction with California and with Quebec. California is among the climate leaders in Canada, in North America, certainly the climate leader in the States. Quebec is among the leaders here in Canada too. I mean, they benefit from all their hydropower, but they've taken serious actions to reduce emissions. And Ontario used to be running with that pack. We're not anymore. Canceling cap and trade was a huge blow to emissions reductions here in Ontario. The government also reduced the target that Ontario had. So it's what's our commitment to reduce emissions now? They also put in this other program for industrial emitters, highly problematic. But not only all of that, also there was billions of dollars in program spending that was created from the proceeds from cap and trade. There were programs to retrofit your home to make it more energy efficient. There were more generous rebates for electric vehicles. There was money being put out there to, in fact, install more electric vehicle charging stations. There were programs to build more bike lanes, to put in more transit, to do all of these climate solutions. $2 billion every year was generated from that program that was all going back into spending, to benefit everybody, to help us kind of make this transition. And now we're without those programs. And so there's a hit on that part too. A massive step backwards. We talk a lot about climate policy with the federal government. We need to have an equal amount of discussion when it comes to the provincial government, because there's those jurisdictional constitutional issues like with the carbon tax, but also a lot of the policy lies in provincial hands, like, are we building transit? The building code, also, how efficient are our buildings? That is something that is within provincial jurisdiction. The electricity system is provincial jurisdiction. And even when the federal government has the carbon price in place, they say, well, it's our system unless you can have a system that's equivalent. And then the rules around what counts as equivalent are pretty weak. And so Ontario gets a pass with a really weak solution, actually. It's hugely problematic.
Well, maybe when the provincial election happens, we'll invite you back on. We'll have this discussion, but we'll talk about the provincial jurisdiction. I'm just looking at our clock, and I'm seeing that we're coming up on our half-hour mark. So I'm going to politely wrap this up, and I won't keep you any longer, Keith. But it's a kind of the motto of the show. We could be going on about this for hours. So we very much appreciate you taking the time to talk with us, Keith. And yeah, next year when we have a provincial election, I think we're going to extend the invitation to you to come back, and we'll talk about this from the provincial viewpoint at the standpoint.
Well, that would be great. I'd be delighted to do that. And I just want to say, though, I really appreciate this conversation, and I really would encourage all your listeners to go get educated about the various climate plans that are out there. You can go to any one of the environmental organizations in Canada's websites, and you can find some materials that you would need to get educated. And vote with climate in mind. This is a critical election. The government that we send to Ottawa is going to be there to the middle of this decade, and this is a critical decade for the fight on climate change. So anyway, thanks for your interest. Thanks for your listeners. Please think about the climate when you go vote.
I'm Ron Montana.
That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.